I was lying in bed, feeling weak and sick, when my husband, Paul, smiled and said, "I only married you because you're the boss's daughter." I looked over at the scarves and gloves I had lovingly knitted for him, now tossed aside like they didn't matter. His words stung. He seemed so disappointed in me, and I knew I had to wake him up to reality. I chuckled at the thought of him realizing how wrong he was, thinking everything was going his way. My name is Kelly Riley. I've been married to Paul for 6 years now. We don't have any children, but we've been living happily together. Paul works a lot and is often away from home. Sometimes I feel lonely, but he always makes an effort to spend time with me on his days off, which helps me manage the loneliness. I met Paul through my father, who was his boss at the time. After we got married, Paul suggested that I become a stay-at-home wife. It seemed like a good idea to me, and I had plenty of time for myself. While supporting Paul, I started making friends with the neighbors, doing some exercise, and taking up sewing. I tried different things to fill my time, but sewing and knitting became my favorite hobbies. Every winter, I would knit scarves and gloves for Paul. My first few attempts weren't great, but I got better with time. Eventually, Paul even told me they were as good as the ones you could buy from a store. Hearing his kind words made me love sewing even more. I dreamed of one day sewing with our future child. I mentioned it to Paul, and he smiled, saying, "Maybe I'll join in and learn when the time comes." It was moments like these that made me feel happy in my life. I also made sure to take good care of the house and always spent quality time with Paul when he had days off. Thanks to his good salary, we had a comfortable life, and from the outside, I probably seemed very lucky. I had no complaints and thought we would continue living quietly like this, just the two of us, with hopes for a child in the future. But about 3 years ago, things started to change. One evening, I was waiting for Paul to come home, as I always did. Suddenly, I felt dizzy and collapsed. Paul had just returned from work and rushed me to the hospital. When I woke up, I found myself lying in a hospital bed. From the conversation between Paul and the doctor, I learned that my condition wasn't minor and would be something I'd have to deal with for the rest of my life. Thankfully, it wasn't life-threatening, but the doctor warned that it could happen again. They recommended I stay in the hospital until I was a bit stronger. Seeing that I was worried, Paul reassured me, "It looks like you'll be in the hospital for a while, but it's okay. I'll come visit whenever I have time off from work. We'll get through this together." He held my hand as he spoke, and his words eased my fear. With my supportive husband by my side, I believed that everything would be fine, even though there wasn't any real reason to think that. True to his word, Paul visited me almost every day after that. He held my hand, asked me how I was feeling, and tried to keep my spirits up. When I told him the hospital days felt long and boring, he brought me my favorite sewing tools. We would sit together, sewing and chatting about little things that happened during the day. Teaching my clumsy husband how to sew was especially fun, and it made me forget the boredom for a while. These happy moments in the hospital went on for about a year. Last winter, I made him another scarf as part of our yearly tradition. But after that, I noticed Paul started visiting less and less. Now, if he showed up once every few weeks, I considered myself lucky. At first, I thought he was just swamped with work, so I kept myself busy with sewing. I even started making a pair of gloves to surprise him the next time he came. The doctor told me I might be able to go home by the end of the year, so I planned to give Paul the gloves as a gift when I was discharged. I put all my love and effort into making those gloves, hoping they would help bridge the time we had been apart. But when Paul finally came to visit after a long absence, his reaction crushed me. I handed him the gloves, and instead of being happy, he looked at them with cold eyes and said, "Are you still making these? They're just becoming a nuisance now." Then, without a second thought, he handed me the scarf I had knitted for him last year, along with divorce papers. The scarf looked untouched, like he had never even worn it. "Has it been 3 years since you've been in the hospital? I heard you'll be discharged soon, but I can't keep taking care of you," he said. "We should get a divorce." I looked down at the divorce papers when I heard Paul's words. He had already signed them. I thought to myself, so, this is where we've ended up. To be honest, ever since he stopped visiting me regularly, I had considered the possibility of divorce more than once. I tried to push those thoughts away, convincing myself that he was just busy with work. But deep down, I knew better. The Paul the First knew would never ignore me, no matter how much work he had. If his job had really gotten busier, he would have told me. When he started disappearing without any explanation, I had a feeling this was coming. That's why, when I asked him why he wanted a divorce, I wasn't as upset as I thought I'd be. I wasn't trying to hold on to him. I knew I had probably become a burden to him. If the kind Paul the First used to know was now asking for a divorce, I figured I didn't really have a choice. But I was still curious. He had once promised we'd get through this together, so I wanted to know why he had changed his mind. When I asked, Paul responded, "Isn't it obvious? Ever since I married you, all I've had are problems. I'm sick of the scarves and gloves you give me every year. I only married you because you're the boss's daughter. How can I be expected to deal with you being sick on top of everything else?" He laughed in a way that felt like he was mocking me. It was as if all the joy I had found in our life together, all the talks we had about love, happiness, and loneliness, meant nothing to him. He made it clear that he thought I was a fool for believing in those things. He continued, "Who even wears a handmade scarf anymore without feeling embarrassed? Getting gifts like that is just annoying." As I listened to him, I glanced at his neck and noticed a high-end scarf I didn't remember giving him. Compared to the scarves I made for him, this one was obviously of much better quality. There was no point in comparing mine to that one. It made me wonder if he had ever actually worn any of the things I made for him. He must have hated them all along, and I just never realized it. After I was hospitalized, my father retired from the company shortly after. That meant Paul no longer had to pretend to care about me to stay in my father's good graces. Plus, having a sick wife might have been a convenient excuse for him at work. In the first year of my illness, he made a big show of visiting me whenever he could, balancing work and showing concern for me. I could easily imagine my father, before he retired, praising Paul at work, saying how hardworking he was while also taking care of his sick wife. Paul had built this image of being a caring husband, and his co-workers respected him for it. But now, it seemed that once my father retired, Paul didn't see any value in me anymore. The part of me that had once been useful to him had been realized, and now he no longer needed me. When I shared my thoughts, feeling sick inside, my husband looked surprised. Then he casually admitted, "Well, it did make work easier. When I mentioned you, everyone felt sorry for me and treated me well. If I worked a bit of overtime, they praised me for being responsible. And if I wanted time off, all I had to say was, 'My wife is sick.' And that was it." He said all of this without a hint of regret. He had used my illness to his advantage in ways I had never noticed. As for the promotion I'm up for, he continued, "I mean, the others are idiots, but I do have to thank your illness for that." I listened quietly with my head down. When I finally looked up, I saw a smug grin on his face. The man I once loved was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. This was his true self. "Well, if I was able to help you, I guess that's good," I said. "We probably won't see each other again, so take care." I handed him the divorce papers. He had no more use for me after that, and quickly turned to leave. And just like that, our divorce was final. After he left, I cried softly to myself. After some time, I was discharged from the hospital and went back to my parent house. When my father heard what had happened, he was furious. "I never thought he could be that kind of person," he said, his voice raised. But for me, it didn't matter anymore. I calmed my father down and told him that once I cleaned up the house, I wanted to move back in with my parents. They understood and told me to do whatever made me happy. For now, I decided to live with them. Before moving back in with my parents, I wanted to visit the house where I had lived with my husband. But when we got there, I found that the front door lock wasn't working. My parents and I exchanged confused looks and decided to ring the doorbell. A stranger answered the door. Feeling puzzled, I asked him about the situation. He told me that he had bought the house a while ago and had been living there for a few months with his wife and child. They seemed happy. My parents were even angrier after hearing this, but I didn't want to cause any trouble for the new family. I bowed my head and quietly left. However, I couldn't just leave it like that, so I called my ex-husband right away. On the phone, he answered casually, "Oh yeah, I sold the house while you were in the hospital. Keeping the money from the sale is like compensation for me." It was my house to begin with, so you don't really have any complaints, right? I couldn't help but sigh at how indifferent he was. I wish he had told me sooner. From what the new owner said, the house had been sold quite a while ago. My husband probably put it up for sale about a year ago, around the time he stopped visiting me. Even if he had planned to divorce me, selling the house without discussing it with me was just outrageous. Our divorce had already been finalized when we signed the papers, but since I was still in the hospital, we had agreed to talk about compensation and dividing assets after my discharge. We had a meeting planned for next week, but he decided to act on his own. It was unbelievable. What made it worse was that he didn't even think he had done anything wrong. So, I calmly told him over the phone, "You really don't understand anything, do you?" "Huh? What do you mean?" he asked, sounding confused. "I'll explain everything in detail next week," I replied and hung up the phone. I smiled at my worried parents and then turned to my father. "I need a favor," I said, sharing my plan with him and asking him to help me get ready for what was coming. "I understand," my father said, his face serious but supportive. "I've already prepared the necessary documents. There's not much time before the meeting next week, but we'll manage." I could see a hint of regret in his eyes, probably because he had once recommended my husband to me. But his anger at what my husband had done seemed to drive him to help me as much as he could. I thanked my father and waited for the day of the meeting. The thought of seeing my husband's reaction made me smile for the first time in a while. With my father's help, we got everything ready for the meeting. We decided to hold the discussion at my parents' home. My parents and I sat together on one side, and my husband sat alone across from us. I'm sure he knew my parents were hurt by the divorce, but it didn't seem to bother him anymore. He didn't show any sign of respect towards them, and his face even held a hint of a smile. His attitude was arrogant, as if he didn't have anything to worry about. "I'm the victim here," he began, "but I'm not going to ask for too much. The money from the sale of the house will be enough." He spoke as if he was being generous, like he was doing us a favor by not asking for more. Seeing his smug attitude, my father's face turned red with anger. I gently placed my hand on his to calm him down. There was no need for us to get upset. We knew that in this discussion, my husband was the one who would be at a disadvantage, not us. "There's something important we need to talk about first," I said, keeping my voice calm. I spoke up and my father handed over a document. It was proof that the land where the house stood was owned by him. "Yes, the house was in your name. There's no question about that," I said. "But the land the house was built on belongs to my father, and he still holds the title to it. That's clear from this document, right?" My husband's expression changed slightly, his brow furrowing. "So what?" he replied. "The house was mine. No one has the right to complain. Do you think you can get back at me with that?" He chuckled, as if he found the whole situation ridiculous. I continued calmly. "It's true that the house was in your name, and legally, you could sell it. I'm sure you checked all of this before you sold the house, and there's no legal issue with your actions." My husband seemed confident, knowing there was no problem from a legal standpoint. "However," I said, "for the family who bought the house, this is a big issue. You sold the house, but since we still own the land, my father can charge them rent. That would definitely cause them trouble, don't you think? The situation isn't what they were led to believe." I paused before continuing. "Now, neither my father nor I intend to charge them rent or make them leave. But we also don't plan on just giving away the rights to our land for nothing. In that case, we would sell the land to the family. We wouldn't demand monthly rent, but it would be a problem for us if they didn't buy the land. My father gifted that land to us to live on, not for it to be handed over to strangers." I added, "And if they don't buy it, the family could sue you." As I said, the deal wasn't what they expected. Can you imagine their frustration? They thought they were buying their dream home, only to find out the land isn't theirs, and they now have more expenses. After we obtained proof of my father's ownership of the land, we went straight to the new family and explained the situation. Thankfully, they understood and agreed that if there was any trouble, it was the seller's responsibility. If things didn't go well with the negotiations, they made it clear they would sue my husband. When I saw my husband's face turn pale, I knew he finally understood the gravity of the situation. He realized that no matter what, This was going to cost him a lot of money because of his mistake. In a trembling voice, he asked, "What should I do then?" I smiled and calmly responded, "The family can buy the land from us, making them the full owners of both the house and the land. Then you would have to cover the cost of the land. This way, everything can be settled smoothly, and there would be no need for the family to sue you. Once they own both the house and the land, all the issues will be resolved. However, since they weren't informed about the land price when they bought the house, they will likely make you pay for it. That's not their problem to deal with, it's yours. The real issue is that the land is in a prime location, and its value could be higher than what you sold the house for. Even if you give up all your assets, it might not be enough. In the end, you could be left with nothing." I paused for a moment and continued, "Another option is for you to buy the house back and then pay for the land. Of course, you have to cover the relocation fee for the family living there. This would give you back both the house and the land, and you could try selling them again, maybe making some money. But after paying for everything, you probably won't end up with much, if anything at all. Whichever option you choose, you'll be at a loss," I added. "And let's not forget about alimony. Your actions have caused me a lot of mental distress, and I plan to ask for compensation for that. Keep that in mind." All this time, Paul had used me as a tool to help his career. Now that I understood this, I felt disgusted by everything he had done. I also planned to file for damages for the emotional harm he caused me. Even though it might be hard to prove and I might not win, bringing up these issues was important, especially considering the situation he's in now. Paul, now cornered, didn't seem to have the ability to fully process what was happening. It looked like all these things could become his reality soon. My father, seeing the opportunity, added, "Even though I'm retired, I still have many connections at the company. I've been talking to some of my old colleagues, and they've told me what you've been saying about my daughter and how you've treated her. People at work have lost all respect for you, Paul." With a cheerful smile, my father delivered this news, and I could see Paul finally grasping the seriousness of the situation. The status he had built by using me and the money he had gained from selling the house without my consent, none of that mattered anymore. "Now," I said, clasping my hands together with a smile, "let's discuss what comes next. We need to settle the division of assets, compensation, and the house." The smile I gave him now was different from any smile I had shown him before. This time, I was smiling more brightly than I had in a long time, feeling a sense of relief and power since our separation. "I hope you understand that your assets will be decided in this meeting," I continued. Paul could only force a laugh, but tears filled his eyes. The negotiations that followed were in my favor. Paul agreed to pay me alimony, and we also settled that he would pay for the land where the house stood. We later explained everything to the family who had bought the house, and in the end, everyone benefited from the agreement, except Paul. He lost everything. The rumors my father had started spread throughout the company, causing Paul to lose his reputation. His expected promotion was delayed as upper management raised concerns. The rumors continued, and soon Paul had no place in the company. My father later informed me that Paul had resigned. I guess you could call it karma. Things gained through using others can disappear just as easily when someone decides to take action. As for me, I'm now living with my parents and running a sewing class. While my classes aren't packed, I've managed to earn a decent income thanks to the support of neighborhood women and children who attend. Even though I never had the chance to sew with my own children like I once dreamed of, I've realized that sharing what I love with others brings me real happiness.